Matthew Chase was just 22 years old when he vanished from Los Angeles in the summer of 1988. On the night of June 8th, after dinner with his close friend and roommate, Teresa Dahl, the two returned to their apartment at around 11:45 p.m. That's when Matt noticed his paycheck still sitting on the coffee table. He was running low on funds, and with the bank likely to take 24 hours to process the deposit, he decided to go to the ATM immediately. Even though the machine was only 2 blocks away, Teresa was concerned that it was getting late and insisted that he take her 1983 Volkswagen GTI. She also asked him to pick up some cat food from across the street on his way back. It should have been a quick trip, 15 minutes tops, but an hour passed and Matt still hadn't returned. Teresa assumed that he was just driving around to clear his head, and so went to bed. But when she woke up the next morning and found his room empty, panic set in. She told her brother, Steve, who also lived at the apartment, and together they contacted the police to report him missing. But because Matt had only been gone for a few hours, officers refused to act. They claimed that it was too early to open a case. Unsatisfied, Teresa and Steve started their own search. Steve called the bank, pretending to be Matt, hoping to learn whether his card had actually been used. What he was told was disturbing. Throughout the night, someone had attempted multiple withdrawals from local ATMs, including one for $280. That request was unusual for 2 reasons. First, $280 exceeded the daily ATM withdrawal limit for Matt's card, and second, his account balance was under $100. He had gone to deposit his paycheck for that exact reason. The fact that Matt had tried to withdraw more money than he actually had access to strongly suggested he was under duress. Teresa and Steve brought this new information to the authorities, and they thankfully began taking the investigation more seriously. At the time, most ATMs didn't have security cameras, but one of the machines that Matt's card had accessed that night did. When investigators reviewed the footage, they discovered a grainy yet unmistakable image of Matt standing at the ATM, only with an unidentified man hovering directly behind him, close enough to see his pin. Police believe that Matt was being threatened and may have intentionally made high withdrawal requests as a distress signal. 2 composite sketches of the unknown figure were created based on the low-resolution photo, but no one recognized the suspect. About a day and a half after Matt's disappearance, his card was used yet again, this time successfully, since his paycheck had cleared. The person withdrew $400, but unfortunately from a machine without a camera. Authorities then immediately froze Matt's account. The next time someone tried to use his card, the ATM confiscated it. Detectives dusted the card for prints, but it came up clean. At the time, investigators believed that Matt may have been struck on the head during a mugging and was wandering the streets of LA with amnesia. This theory actually held a little weight. Matt's roommates, Teresa and Steve, had visited a local rescue mission and heard from regulars that on several occasions, someone matching Matt's appearance had come in for meals. As such, both they and Matt's parents were convinced he was still alive. 3 weeks went by with no further developments. Then, on June 27th, Teresa's red VW turned up surprisingly close to the ATM where Matt had last been seen. Investigators concluded that the car had likely been dumped there days or even weeks after Matt's disappearance. Like the car had been wiped of fingerprint evidence, but there was one possible clue: a blue bandana on the back seat. On it were the letters ES, PBS, CLS. Police interpreted ES-PBS as referring to the East Side Playboys, a known gang in the area. Still, no physical evidence or direct witness testimony tied any individual member to the crime, and again, the case went cold. 3 months after he disappeared, Matt's body was discovered in a dry ravine in Pasadena. He had been shot in the head. The autopsy suggested that he had died within days of his disappearance. The folks at the mission had been mistaken. With no suspect, no witnesses, and no viable forensic evidence, the case would remain unsolved for the next 30 years. Then, in 2018, LAPD detectives announced a breakthrough. They had identified Matt's killer, a man named David Bear Meza, a 20-year-old gang member from the Rampart area. Mezza's former girlfriend had come forward and identified him as the man in the ATM surveillance photo. According to investigators, that was enough to close the case. However, the timeline didn't entirely add up. Mezza had died in a drive-by shooting just 2 days after Matt's disappearance. As such, there's no way he could have worked alone. After all, someone dumped Teresa's car near the scene weeks later. After 3 decades of silence, the people who loved Matt finally had a name, if not a full explanation. What is clear is that a young man trying to cash a paycheck never made it home, and his friends, through sheer persistence, helped crack one of LA's most haunting cold cases. This message is sponsored by Raycon. September's here. Summer's wrapping up. The kids are back at school, and change is in the air. For me, that means finding a new rhythm, and today's sponsor, Raycon, have just the ticket. Their new bone conduction headphones. Unlike regular headphones, they deliver off-ear audio using vibrations to send sounds straight through your bones, hence the name. That means you get crystal clear music, podcasts and calls, while still staying aware of the world around you. I like to use my bone conduction headphones while I'm out jogging. I just whack on my favourite playlist, and don't have to choose between audio and awareness. They're IP68 waterproof and dustproof, tough enough for any route, and have a massive 13-hour battery life, so I can really rely on them. But my favourite thing about these bone conduction headphones has to be the price tag. Raycon delivers the same top-tier performance as the big brands at half the cost, and with over 3 million happy customers and a 30-day guarantee, you can be sure you're in safe hands. So if you'd like to support the channel while grabbing your own pair of bone conduction headphones, click the link in the description box, or go to buyraycon.com/masqueradebc to get 20% off site-wide. That's buyraycon.com/masqueradebc, sponsored by Raycon. "61-year-olds Carol and James Reggie Sumner were quiet, generous, trusting people, though both in poor health. Reg was diabetic, and Carol was recovering from cancer. They had left behind their old life in South Carolina and settled in Jacksonville, hoping for peace in their later years. But in the summer of 2005, their kindness was betrayed in the worst way imaginable. The story begins with Tiffany Cole, a young woman whose father once lived next to the Sumners. Tiffany wasn't especially close to Reggie and Carol, but when the couple decided to sell their home in Charleston, she bought a car from them on installments. From then on, she would periodically visit their new place in Florida to drop off the payments, and when she showed up in June 2005 with her boyfriend, Michael James Jackson, the Sumners, true to form, offered them a bed for the night. It was a gesture of hospitality, but when Michael learned that Reggie and Carol had sold their old home for nearly $100,000, he no longer saw them as generous hosts. He saw 2 elderly, frail targets, isolated and now newly flush with cash. Back in South Carolina, Michael and Tiffany spent several weeks plotting how to get their hands on the Sumners' money. Together, they agreed to raid the aging couple's home, steal their valuables, and access their bank accounts. However, the Sumners were well aware of their faces, and so they would need to employ some heavies. Thus, they approached their 2 18-year-old accomplices, Alan Wade and Bruce Nixon. On the night of July 8th, 2005, Alan and Bruce knocked on the Sumners' door, pretending to be lost teenagers looking to use the phone. Of course, Reggie and Carol let them in. But unbeknownst to the Sumners, the boys carried with them a black bag packed with duct tape, gloves, and a convincing toy gun. Within moments, the Sumners were bound and gagged. Michael and Tiffany waited outside in a rented Mazda RX-8, keeping their heads low. Meanwhile, Alan and Bruce ransacked the home for valuables and bank details before forcing the Sumners into the trunk of their own Lincoln Town Car. Then, the convoy set off, the Mazda in front to draw police if necessary, the Lincoln behind with Reggie and Carol sealed inside. At a gas station, the group stopped for fuel, then pressed on into Georgia. Hours later, in the woods, Reggie and Carol were dragged from the trunk of their own vehicle. They were forced to give up their bank pins before being tossed into a pre-dug hole in the ground. You see, days earlier, the 4 co-conspirators had driven out to that wooded stretch of southern Georgia and dug a grave. Before they had even set their plan in motion, they had decided there should be no witnesses. Michael became enraged when he saw the duct tape over the Sumner's eyes had loosened, saying that he didn't want them to see his face in their final moments. It was a mind thing, he said. After the tape was stuck back down, Reggie and Carol were made to lie down in the dirt. They were then callously buried alive. The killers abandoned the Lincoln in a field, then returned to the Sumner's home to steal the couple's computer, which they pawned for cash. Over the following days, they began draining the Sumner's accounts, hitting ATMs across Florida, withdrawing several $1,000s in total. Surveillance footage from one machine captured Michael Jackson withdrawing money from Reggie's account, money which he, Tiffany, and Alon spent on champagne and limousine rides. Aware that the couple had been reported missing, 2 days after the murder, the killers tried another trick. A phone call to the police, in which they pretended to be Reggie and Carol.
How you doing? My name is Reggie. I'm out of town with my wife right now. Her sister passed away. A friend of ours that lives in the neighborhood called this morning and said that the garage was open and that the Lincoln was missing. We just moved actually to there not long ago from South Carolina. Do you have anybody that we can contact to help us make sure that everything in the house should be there?
No, sir. My family lives in another state.
When this recording was played to the Sumner's daughter, Rhonda, she confirmed that the voices didn't belong to her parents. On July 14th, investigators traced the ATM withdrawals and tracked the group to a motel in Charleston. Inside, they found some of the Sumner's stolen belongings. Michael, Tiffany, and Alon were arrested. Bruce Nixon, who was later picked up in Jacksonville, cracked almost immediately. He told investigators everything, including the location of the burial site. 8 days after the murders, Reggie and Carol were finally found buried in that shallow pit. According to Bruce, they had been clinging to each other when they were forced into the trunk and into their grave. Even in death, they hadn't let go. The medical examiner later confirmed what investigators already feared. Sand and soil were packed into their throats and airways. They had suffocated slowly, inhaling the dirt as it filled the grave. After a lot of finger-pointing, downplaying, and denial, Michael Jackson, Tiffany Cole, and Alan Wade were all charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and robbery. Tiffany claimed that she had no intention of killing her old neighbors, insisting that Michael was the mastermind behind the entire heist. Yet despite pleading ignorance, she couldn't explain why she had pretended to be Carol Sumner on the phone to the police, nor why she had happily enjoyed the Sumner's money in the aftermath of their deaths. Ultimately, Michael, Tiffany, and Alon were all found guilty and sentenced to death in 2007. Because he cooperated with the investigation, Bruce Nixon was instead sentenced to 45 years behind bars. In 2016, the US Supreme Court ruled that Florida's death penalty system, which allowed for non-unanimous jury votes, was unconstitutional. This meant that all 3 death sentences were overturned and had to be reconsidered. In 2022, Alan Wade was resentenced to life without parole. In court, he told the judge that the version of himself who committed those crimes no longer exists. In August 2023, Michael Jackson was again sentenced to death. Witnesses reiterated that he was the ringleader who gave the orders, who controlled the plan, and who made sure the couple never came out alive. Just days later, Tiffany Cole was spared the death penalty by a 10-2 jury vote. She's now serving life without parole. "81-year-old William Singer and his 64-year-old wife, Barbara, had built a quiet life together in Phoenix, Arizona over the years. Now enjoying retirement, William had once been a helicopter pilot in Chicago, training emergency responders, while Barbara had been a nurse, assisting countless members of her community. Friends and neighbors described them as gentle, helpful, the kind of people who lived simply and kept to themselves, the kind of couple who were still very much in love. By the summer of 2014, their health was failing, but they still lived independently in their modest home near 35th Avenue and Bell Road. They had no enemies to speak of, no debts, nothing to suggest they were in imminent danger. But on the night of June 28th, 2014, something unusual happened. Security cameras outside a Wells Fargo ATM captured both William and Barbara making cash withdrawals just before 10:30 p.m. It was a sweltering evening, and the time of night made the transaction stand out. The couple rarely left their home after dark, and even more strange was the fact that they withdrew money separately, one after the other. Detectives would later say that the ATM footage didn't look right. William especially appeared anxious, as if someone might be directing him just out of frame. They now believe the couple may have been under duress, forced to take out cash before returning home. 4 days later, on July 2nd, police carried out a welfare check after neighbors noticed that the Singer house had gone quiet. What they found inside was gruesome. Both William and Barbara had been murdered. William was discovered slumped in a chair, Barbara in another room, indicating that they had been separated before being killed. There were clear signs of a violent struggle, and as one detective put it, the pair hadn't been killed cleanly. They had been slaughtered. Yet there were no broken windows, no splintered door frames, no sign of a forced entry at all. Whoever took their lives either followed them back home after watching the couple make their withdrawals, or, more likely, rode back with them and forced his way inside. The ATM surveillance footage became a central clue in this case. It offered a narrow window into what may have been the start of the crime, and it remains one of the only pieces of physical evidence. Detectives believe that the killer, or killers, were nearby that night, waiting, directing, and perhaps threatening the Singers just outside the camera's view. Neighbors later recalled seeing suspicious people in the area around the time of the murders. Men posing as utility workers, strangers lingering on the street. Police even released sketches of 2 unidentified men spotted near the house, but none of the tips brought a breakthrough. Their son, William Jr., has spent years urging anyone with information to come forward. He described his parents as ordinary, loving people who should have been able to live out their final years in peace. Instead, their home became the scene of a brutal and unexplained double homicide. In September 1998, 29-year-old Kayo Matsuzawa, a tourist from Yamagata, Japan, landed in Auckland. She had come to New Zealand the year before to study English, but had spent most of her time in Christchurch and was eager to explore the rest of the country. Friends described her as cheerful, kind, someone who could befriend anyone. She wrote postcards home regularly, promising her mother that she would return in November. Auckland was just another stop on her travels, and a safe one at that. In fact, she had needed to constantly reassure her family back home that New Zealand was an extremely safe country and that there was no need to worry about her well-being. At around midday on the 11th, Kayo's flight touched down. At 12:14 p.m, she was filmed by a bank security camera stepping off an airport bus on Queen Street. She then immediately checked into the backpackers hostel on Fort Street, where she planned to stay for 3 nights, and neatly arranged her belongings in her dorm. Around an hour later, she set off to explore the city. At 3:32 p.m, a BNZ security camera caught her walking past the Countrywide building, a mere 2-minute stroll from her hostel. She appeared to be alone. It was the last confirmed sighting of Kayo alive. Days passed with no word from the young tourist. Then, on September 16th, her handbag, passport, and insurance papers surfaced in a rubbish bin on Albert Street. On September 22nd, a fire alarm technician opened a utility cupboard in the Centre Court building at 131 Queen Street. As the door swung open, a strange smell, similar to ammonia, hit his nostrils, and he was jump-scared by a mannequin which fell towards him and hit the floor. But his surprise turned to horror when he realized what he was actually looking at. It wasn't a mannequin. It was the partially decomposed, disrobed body of Kayo Matsuzawa. The cupboard where she was found was hidden in a confusing maze of stairwells shared between the center court and B&Z buildings. It was a space accessible through multiple routes: a food court, a pub, a car park. Access cards were required for some doors, but people who worked there admitted that strangers often slipped in through side entrances. The room with the cupboard itself was locked, but could be opened with something as simple as a screwdriver. The state of Kayo's body meant that her cause of death couldn't be determined. Male DNA was found under her fingernails, suggesting that she had fought back against her attacker, but no match has ever been made public. None of her clothing, nor her crescent-shaped silver earrings or delicate gold ring with a pink stone have ever been recovered. Police considered whether she had been given a drink which had been spiked, perhaps at the QF Tavern connected to the building, or the International Food Hall inside Center Court. Those who knew Kayo described her as a light drinker who could barely finish a bottle of beer. She wasn't the type to wander into bars alone. However, she was friendly enough to go with new acquaintances. Her friend, Naomi Saishu, said that she was the kind of person who could easily make friends, especially at a hostel. She wasn't a shy person, and her English skills were very good. In the opinion of many, she may have met and put her trust in the wrong individual. Over time, more evidence, or the lack thereof, presented itself. On the weekend Kayo vanished, the electronic swipe card logs that tracked who went in and out of the B&Z and Center Court buildings had been wiped. Even the paper printouts were missing. On top of that, the disposal of Kayo's belongings raised more questions. They'd been found dumped in a public bin 5 days after she had disappeared. Whoever took her life had almost certainly returned to the scene before her body was discovered and removed and destroyed evidence. And whoever they were careful. There were no fingerprints, no DNA aside from that found under Kayo's nails. But with so much evidence missing from the scene, it's noteworthy that the killer didn't remove Kayo's body from the stairwell cupboard. Given that a car park was directly attached to the building, that points to someone without access to a vehicle, perhaps another tourist. Over the years, several people of interest were identified and eliminated. A fire alarm technician, a man connected to a language school in the building, even a British naval trainer later convicted of murder in the UK. For a while, a Ukrainian backpacker with mental health issues who stayed in Kayo's hostel briefly became the prime suspect. He was eccentric, and a witness claimed to have seen him with an East Asian woman. He'd also been seen pawning jewelry, and suspiciously, had left the country the same day Kayo's body was found. But none of these leads led anywhere. The jewelry the man pawned was located and determined not to be Kayo's. The man himself was tracked down by Interpol 2 years later and interviewed. Investigators determined he wasn't involved. In 2018, police finally revealed a new development. A suspect who had used their bank card at the B&Z building's ATM the very same afternoon Kayo disappeared. That puts him in the immediate vicinity of the crime at the precise time it happened. They've yet to release the ATM surveillance images to the public and haven't said who this man might be or why he's considered such a strong suspect. All they've said is that he's a promising match. What is clear is that Kayo's final moments led her less than 2 minutes away from her hostel, past the Center Court building and into a trap just steps from one of the busiest streets in New Zealand's biggest city. Whoever the culprit was, the authorities believe it wasn't his first rodeo, and that Kayo may have encountered a serial killer that fateful afternoon. According to lead investigator Scott Beard, "We believe it was someone who was quite confident, got enough to talk to a Japanese tourist. Somebody who was charming, who somehow gave her the confidence to speak to them, and maybe even go with them." For Kayo's family, the pain has never healed. Her mother described her as kind, friendly, someone who made everyone around her happy. She had promised to return home in November. Instead, her life was cut short just hours after arriving in Auckland, and the person who killed her is still out there. A huge thank you to my supporters here on YouTube and over on Patreon, especially my biggest supporters: Holly Lyons, Thomas Almond, Alana Pons, asiamina, Alicia 1996 V, Azrael Warakai, Aðalsteinn Traustason, Colin Monsma, Louthan, Emzetz, Farewelltattoosjaxfl, George Lopez, Gina Valera, Gracearchie, Hamish, John Stewart Muller, Lucy Kushinada, Michelle F. Granfield, Mistyblue Longie, Orlando Torres, Peter Lulgjuraj, Sviso Skivcool, DNS Mum, Terry Ford, and Geokai. Thank you guys so much for your continued support. Remember to hit that like button, and I'll see you all again very soon.